The penthouse apartment hummed with the energy of Seattle's elite. Tech moguls, venture capitalists, and social climbers all dressed in their finest, champagne flutes glinting under crystal chandeliers. David stood near the marble fireplace, watching the crowd with practiced composure. 20 years in intelligence work had taught him to read rooms, to blend into backgrounds, to become whoever the situation required. His wife Victoria glided through the gathering like a swan among ducks, her emerald dress catching the light with each calculated movement. She'd been planning this party for months, a celebration of her new position as creative director at Lumina Digital, one of the city's most prestigious marketing firms. David had supported her ambitions, encouraged her networking, even understood when work dinners ran late and weekend conferences pulled her away. What he hadn't understood, until recently, was why. "Oh, and this is my roommate," Victoria said brightly, approaching with two men David recognized from her Instagram posts. She placed a manicured hand on his arm with the casual affection one might show a brother. "David shares the apartment. Helps with the rent. You know how expensive the city is." The taller man, Sterling, some cryptocurrency consultant, extended his hand. "Roommate? In this market, smart move. I'm trying to convince Victoria here to grab drinks after this winds down." David shook his hand firmly, noting the Patek Philippe watch, the cologne that cost more than most people's car payments. "Practical arrangement," he said mildly. "Victoria's always been financially savvy." She laughed, that performative trill she'd perfected. "David's very understanding. Gives me plenty of space." Her fingers trailed down Sterling's arm. "I value my independence." Clearly, Sterling smirked, emboldened. David watched Victoria lean closer to the man, watched her employ every technique from the playbook of flirtation, the laugh at unfunny jokes, the strategic touches, the lowered lashes. Around them, her colleagues and friends participated in the charade, some knowingly, others simply following her lead. He was furniture in his own home, a convenient prop in whatever narrative she'd constructed. The second man, Oliver, a gallery owner she'd mentioned wanting to impress, barely acknowledged David's presence. "Victoria, you simply must see the Rothko piece I acquired. Private viewing, just us. Tomorrow evening." "I'd love that," she purred. David excused himself, moving through the crowd toward the balcony. Several guests made space for the roommate, their pity or complicity evident in averted eyes. He stepped into the cool night air, Seattle skyline spreading before him like a circuit board of light and shadow. His phone vibrated. A message from his handler, "Package delivered. Ready when you are." David typed back, 30 minutes. He'd given her chances, countless opportunities to come clean, to explain the late nights and suspicious receipts, the way she'd gradually rewritten their relationship for public consumption. He'd hoped she might remember the man she'd married, the vows they'd taken. But Victoria had made her choice. Tonight, she'd learn the cost of underestimating her roommate. David re-entered the party, accepting a whiskey from a passing waiter. He positioned himself near the window wall, where he could observe without appearing isolated. Victoria had mastered the art of working a room, but he'd spent 2 decades reading human behavior at the highest stakes possible. She held court near the Barcelona chairs, surrounded by admirers. Sterling remained close, his interest obvious. Oliver had been joined by another gallery associate. A third man, Graham, who ran some boutique investment firm, completed her orbit. They laughed too loudly at her stories, leaned too close during her asides. "Quite the hostess," someone said beside him. David turned to find Natasha, Victoria's work rival and tonight's unlikely guest. Her inclusion had surprised him until he understood. Victoria wanted witnesses to her triumph, even antagonistic ones. "She's in her element," David agreed neutrally. "Must be strange," Natasha said, studying him with sharp eyes. "Being introduced as the roommate. Unless..." She let the implication hang. Unless you're very secure. Or very naive." She sipped her martini. "For what it's worth, I think it's cruel." But then, Victoria's always prioritized perception over principle. Before David could respond, Victoria's voice cut through the ambient noise. "Everyone. A toast." She stood elevated on the raised living room platform, commanding attention effortlessly. To new beginnings. To success. To living authentically. Glasses raised. The crowd echoed her sentiments. And to the people who support us, even from the background, she added, her gaze landing briefly on David with what might have been challenge or mockery. The roommates who keep the lights on. Polite laughter rippled through the room. David raised his glass, his expression unchanged. Sterling moved beside Victoria, proprietary. Speaking of authentic living, Victoria, didn't you mention you're essentially free for that Tahiti resort opening next month? I've got a +1 invitation. Did I mention that? Victoria's smile was radiant. I might be available. Depends on my schedule. I'll check my calendar too, Oliver interjected. Though I was hoping to whisk you to Art Basel, Miami. David checked his watch. 20 minutes. Graham joined the competition. Gentlemen, please. Victoria's clearly more cultured than beach resorts and art fairs. Victoria, my firm's hosting a private ski weekend in Aspen. Very exclusive guest list. Victoria basked in the attention, her earlier introduction of David as roommate growing more absurd with each invitation, each public claim on her time and affection. Around the room, guests whispered behind hands, their entertainment obvious. Some pitied David, others assumed him complicit in an open arrangement, still others simply enjoyed the drama. You're all so generous, Victoria demurred, playing coy. A woman has options, you know. Indeed, David said quietly from his position near the window. Something in his tone made several nearby guests glance his way, but Victoria ignored him, continuing her performance. His phone buzzed. The message was simple, in position. Confirm. David typed, confirmed. Proceed. He pocketed the phone and moved toward the center of the room. The crowd parted instinctively, that subtle shift that happens when someone carries authority, even unspoken. He'd spent enough time among world leaders and military brass to project it unconsciously. Victoria, he said clearly, his voice carrying without being raised. Before the evening concludes, might I have a word? It's rather important. She turned, irritation flickering across her features before she masked it. David, we're celebrating. Can't it wait? I'm afraid not, he said. It's about our living arrangement. I think your guests deserve clarity. The room went quiet, sensing drama. Victoria's eyes narrowed, but her smile remained fixed. Clarity? David, everyone understands our situation perfectly well. She gestured expansively. Modern arrangements for modern times. Indeed, David said, stepping further into the room's center. The crowd instinctively formed a circle, drawn to potential conflict like moths to flame. Though I wonder if your understanding matches theirs. Or mine. Sterling moved protectively closer to Victoria. Look, man, if you've got an issue with Victoria's success. I have no issue with her success, David interrupted calmly. I encouraged her career advancement. Supported every late night, every networking event, every business trip. He paused, meeting Victoria's gaze. What I question is the narrative. Victoria's laugh was brittle. David, you're embarrassing yourself. Perhaps you've had too much to drink. I've had exactly one whiskey. You, however, have had quite a bit of champagne, along with intoxicating amounts of attention. He looked around the room. Tell me, how many of you knew Victoria was married? Silence. Confused glances. Natasha watched with barely concealed fascination. Married. Oliver said uncertainly. Victoria said she was divorced. From some government worker. Not divorced, David corrected. Still married. 14 years this past April. And not to a government worker, exactly, though that's technically accurate. Victoria's composure cracked. David, stop this right now. You're ruining everything. I'm clarifying things, he said. You introduced me as your roommate. You've been accepting invitations from multiple men, in my presence, in my home. I thought perhaps your guests should know the full picture before committing to Tahiti vacations or Aspen weekends.
Graham cleared his throat. This is awkward.
Victoria, you said.
She said what she needed to say, David continued, to craft the image she wanted.
The successful, unattached creative director. Available, desirable, unencumbered. He turned back to Victoria. But reality has a way of intruding, doesn't it? Victoria's face flushed with anger and humiliation. You agreed to keep a low profile. You said your work required discretion. And you used that discretion to erase me entirely, David countered. There's a difference between maintaining privacy and committing fraud. Which, incidentally, brings me to the important matter I mentioned. He pulled out his phone, pulling up a document. See, while you were building your new narrative, I was doing what I do best, research and analysis. Due diligence, one might say. What are you talking about? Victoria's voice rose. David looked around the room. How many of you invested in Victoria's personal venture? The boutique consulting firm she was launching on the side. Several hands raised hesitantly, including Sterling's and Graham's. And how much did she tell you about where that investment capital was going? Digital infrastructure, Sterling said defensively. Marketing platforms. Industry connections. Interesting, David said. Because according to bank records I've obtained, legally, through proper channels, most of that money went to personal expenses. Designer clothes. This apartment's renovation. Luxury travel. In fact, the business entity she registered doesn't actually exist in any operational form. The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victoria's face went pale. You're lying. You're just bitter because I outgrew our marriage. I have documentation, David said calmly. Screenshots, bank statements, email chains. Would you like me to share them? I'm sure your investors would be interested. Natasha laughed suddenly, the sound sharp and delighted. Oh, this is better than I imagined. Who the hell are you? Sterling demanded of David, his earlier confidence evaporating. What kind of government worker has access to bank records? David smiled thinly. That's the right question. Victoria knows, though she conveniently forgot to mention it to any of you. David walked to the fireplace mantel, where Victoria had artfully arranged photos, all of her alone or with friends, their wedding pictures conspicuously absent. He picked up a framed image of her accepting some marketing award. Victoria knows I can't discuss my work in detail, he said. That's true. But she also knows exactly what I do, who I work for, and the resources at my disposal. He set the frame down. She just assumed I wouldn't use them. Use them for what? Oliver asked, backing away slightly. Are you threatening her? I don't make threats, David said. I deal in information and consequences. For instance, Victoria, would you like to tell everyone what arrived via courier this afternoon? The documents you signed for while I was out. Victoria's hand trembled as she set down her champagne. I don't know what you're talking about. The divorce papers, David said. Initiated by me, citing adultery and financial fraud. Along with a forensic accounting report detailing how you spent money from our joint accounts funded primarily by my salary, on your affairs and your fake business venture. The room erupted in whispers. Sterling stepped away from Victoria as if she'd become radioactive. But more interesting than the divorce, David continued, are the other documents. The ones from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Seems that accepting money for a business venture that doesn't exist constitutes fraud. And the IRS is very curious about unreported income and falsified business expenses. Graham's face went red. You're telling me I gave $50,000 to a fake company? Oh, you're not the only one, David said, consulting his phone. According to my records, Victoria collected investments from 7 people. Total amount, approximately $400,000. That crosses the federal threshold for wire fraud. Victoria found her voice, though it shook. You bastard.
You're ruining my life.
No, David said, his tone hardening for the first time.
I'm revealing who you actually are. There's a difference.
He looked around the room. My wife has spent the last year systematically erasing our marriage, conducting affairs, and committing fraud. She gambled that my need for professional discretion would keep me silent, that I'd be too understanding, too weak to call her out.
You work for the government, Victoria spat. Some desk job in analysis. Don't pretend you're important.
David smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes.
I do work in analysis. Have for 20 years. But not from a desk.
And not in some mid-level bureaucracy. He pulled out his wallet, extracting a card and holding it up. My actual title is Deputy Director of the National Intelligence Coordination Office. I report directly to the Director of National Intelligence. I have security clearance that grants me access to virtually any database in the country. I've briefed presidents. I've coordinated operations across 5 continents. The card glinted in the light, an official government credential that several guests recognized from news coverage and political thrillers.
Natasha whistled low. Holy shit.
But more relevantly to tonight, David continued, I have the resources to investigate financial crimes, to coordinate with federal agencies, and to ensure that justice is served.
Victoria knew this.
She just thought our marriage meant I'd never use those resources against her.
He pocketed the card. She was wrong.
Victoria's composure shattered completely.
You can't do this. I'm your wife.
You're the woman who introduced me as her roommate, David corrected coldly. The woman who erased our marriage while using my income to fund her affairs and fraudulent schemes. The woman who gambled that I loved her too much to fight back.
He paused.
You gambled wrong.
Sterling was already moving toward the door.
I want my money back.
Get in line, Graham muttered.
Everyone who invested will be contacted by federal investigators, David said. You'll have the opportunity to provide statements and documentation. Some of you may recover your funds, depending on how the asset seizure proceeds.
Oliver looked sick. Asset seizure.
Standard procedure in fraud cases, David said. This apartment, for instance, purchased with fraudulent funds. Victoria's car. Her designer wardrobe. All subject to seizure and liquidation to repay victims. Victoria sank into a chair, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. The exodus began almost immediately. Sterling and Graham left without another word, likely already calling their lawyers. Oliver paused at the door, looking back at Victoria with something between pity and disgust, then departed. Others followed in clusters, their earlier excitement about the party replaced by shock and the urgent need to gossip elsewhere. Natasha approached David, extending her hand. I know I shouldn't say this, but that was magnificent. She's been insufferable for months, lauding her authentic life over everyone. I take no pleasure in it, David said quietly, but I couldn't let her continue destroying lives.
The investors
will be fine, mostly. The federal government is efficient at recovering funds once they're motivated. He glanced at Victoria, who sat motionless, staring at nothing. She, however, is looking at serious legal consequences. Natasha nodded and left, leaving David alone with his wife. For a long moment, neither spoke. The apartment, so recently filled with noise and celebration, felt cavernous in its silence.
Why?
Victoria finally asked, her voice small. Why humiliate me like this? In front of everyone? David moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. You humiliated yourself, Victoria. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences. He turned to face her. For a year, I watched you rewrite our history. I gave you chances to come clean, to work on our marriage, to be honest. You chose deception every time. I felt trapped, she said. You were always gone, always focused on work I couldn't discuss with anyone. I felt invisible. So you made me invisible instead, David said. And when that wasn't enough, you committed fraud. Used our money for affairs.
Built a fake business to scam people who trusted you. He shook his head. That's not about feeling trapped. That's about character. Victoria's tears were genuine now. What happens to me? That depends on several factors, David said. How cooperative you are with investigators. How much money can be recovered. Whether your victims want to press charges. He paused. But realistically, you're looking at fraud charges, possibly tax evasion. Best case scenario, you lose everything and spend years rebuilding your reputation. Worst case, federal prison time. She buried her face in her hands. My career is over. Your career was built on lies, David said without sympathy. This was always how it would end. He walked to the door, collecting his jacket from the closet. My lawyers will contact you tomorrow. I'll be staying at a hotel for now. The lease on this apartment is in both our names, but given that it's crime scene evidence, you probably won't be here long anyway. Where will I go? Victoria asked desperately. I don't know, David said. Maybe find a roommate. I hear that's a practical arrangement. The irony wasn't lost on her. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. David opened the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I did love you. The real you, not the persona you created. But that person, if she ever actually existed, is long gone. What's left is someone I don't recognize and can't trust. He stepped into the hallway. Goodbye, Victoria. He closed the door on her sobs, on the ruins of their marriage, on the life she'd tried to fabricate. The elevator descended smoothly, carrying him away from the penthouse and its broken dreams. Outside, Seattle's night air was crisp and clean. David's phone buzzed, his handler checking in, making sure he was all right. He typed a brief confirmation, then hailed a cab. As the city lights blurred past the window, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: relief. The pretense was over. The lies were exposed. Victoria would face consequences, the defrauded investors would find justice, and he could finally move forward. He'd spent 20 years protecting the country from threats foreign and domestic, gathering intelligence, coordinating operations, making impossible decisions. But he'd never imagined his greatest act of investigation would be against his own wife. The cab pulled up to his hotel, a modest place, anonymous and quiet. David checked in using an alias, a habit from years of operational security. In his room, he sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed himself to feel the weight of the evening. Tomorrow, there would be depositions and legal proceedings, paperwork and investigations. The slow machinery of justice grinding forward. But tonight, the truth had been spoken. The mask had been removed. Victoria's performance had ended not in applause but in silence, the stunned quiet of an audience realizing they'd been complicit in a lie. David looked at his phone one last time before turning it off. No messages from Victoria. No pleas or apologies. Perhaps she finally understood there was nothing left to say. He'd been her roommate, her prop, her fool. But he'd also been something she'd forgotten, a man with resources, authority, and the absolute unwillingness to be anyone's victim. The room was quiet. David closed his eyes, and for the first time in a year, slept peacefully.